I've always studied small stuff like plankton and oysters and stuff like that are not necessarily like large and charismatic, but this has its own charisma and its own appeal as an organism. So the Olympia oyster is our only native oyster in the state of Washington. Here we have one. They're almost opalescent. They're not as sharp on the edges, but they never get very big.
When most people think of oysters, they think, oh, Pacific oyster, which is actually a Japanese oyster. The Pacific oyster is what everybody knows, what people buy in the restaurants, what they go out harvesting for. And the Pacific oysters are much bigger, they grow much faster, and they're a very useful commercial product. The Marine Resources Committee became interested in the Olympia oysters in the early 2000s, and Discovery Bay is one of 19 sites in Puget Sound where there were historically large populations.
So I work for the Jamestown Sklallam tribe, and Olympia oysters are a really important food going back millennia in this area. So where we find ourselves now is this species that was very common. I mean, thousands and thousands of acres in the Puget Sound is, certainly in terms of a habitat, really uncommon.
If you think about engineers as people who build things, the Olympia oysters are building an ecological habitat with their shell. That shell creates a system of shingles or layers with spaces in between, and that then becomes habitat for a number of other invertebrates, small fish, crabs, which are then food for shorebirds, for other bigger animals to eat. So they're engineering a whole habitat that's a structure. In 2013, we identified some areas in Discovery Bay that were near a remnant Olympia oyster population.
We are trying to boost the numbers of Olympia oysters in Discovery Bay. So what we're really trying to do here is give them a leg up. So you're confronted with a very muddy substrate. Baby oysters are larvae for a little while, so they're drifting around in the water column, and then they look for something hard to settle on. One of our restoration activities has been to add shell, with the eventual idea that we'll add enough shell that it'll generate enough Olympia oysters that the Olympia oysters create a habitat all on their own.
Olympia oysters, as filter feeders, are helping to clean the water. But I think the other thing they're doing is they're creating that habitat in the lower tidal areas that provides food for the out-migrating salmon smolt that have been part of the restoration efforts in Snow and Salmon Creek.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 young Olympias on it, which is totally cool. Yeah, exactly what we were hoping for. What I envision is being able to walk out here when I retire and go, there's Olympia oysters everywhere.